Well, good evening, everybody. Can you hear me? Those who can see me? Those who can reply, can you hear me? Clive, Roland, nod? Okay, good. Welcome to the Contemporary Arts Society for Wales's first Tuesday evening lectures of the season. And for the first time, the Contemporary Arts Society for Wales, instead of meeting in a dark area of Cardiff on a wet Tuesday evening, is meeting worldwide through the benefits of Zoom and YouTube Live. We're very pleased that so many people are able to join us. We believe around 200 people are watching this session tonight or participating in it. And they're spread geographically from San Francisco in the west to Berlin in the east. Normally, the Contemporary Art Society struggles to get people out of their houses in the suburbs of Cardiff, let alone around the rest of Wales or so much of the world. So welcome, everybody. I volunteered to do a session with Clive for tonight because of the pandemic and social isolation. And I did it on a bit of a misconception that I was thinking, well, we're in the same house, we're living in the same house, we can immediately do an interview with each other. But of course, we've ended up in two different rooms on different computers for technological reasons. So actually, Clive could have been interviewed by somebody much better. But here we are. It's a pleasure to be doing it, and I hope you enjoy this evening. Hello, Clive.
Hello, Peter. Hello, everybody.
Is everything all right on the first floor?
Everything's fine on the first floor. I have my little friend over my shoulder here. I feel as though I'm about to start a Harry Potter film.
We're going to be able to open to questions during the session. So we're going to, through Zoom, those people who are participating through Zoom will be able to post questions using chat, which I'll try and weave in during the event. And then towards the end, I'll also open the opportunity for people to ask questions live on Zoom. And I should tell you that we're being recorded for potential use on YouTube later, so bear that in mind if you're shy of appearing. We decided to focus tonight on birds as a theme, and the reason for that was that Clive has been working very much recently on birds in relation to the owl and the nightingale, illustrating the work of the translation of Simon Armitage, which we'll come to in more depth a little bit later. It's been non-stop work on birds really this year, and in many cases the birds are appearing in cages like this bird cage here, or in towers, as you'll see in another image later. So my first question to Clive really is there a connection between the way you've presented some of these birds and the fascination with birds and the situation we find ourselves in?
I think that it just so happened when we went into lockdown that I had a number of outstanding commissions, and it just turned out that thematically birds were underlying them. But I've always loved birds. I use birds in my work quite a lot. But it has been interesting working on these three projects. The one is Birdhouse, a small illustrated book designed for today, this new Simon Armitage translation of the medieval poem The Owl and the Nightingale, and also a project I've been working on with Dan Bug at Penfold Press called The Tiger's Bride, which has birds in it. And I think that what I focused on a lot have been toy birds, folk art birds, birds from the imagination as opposed to the observed birds that I use often when I'm working at the easel. And there has been a kind of delight in celebrating the beauty of folk art and the imagination of folk art in these particular projects during lockdown, because it's been a very bright and cheerful world to be working in when so much of what we hear by way of news is quite dark.
You've here's another image. Birds possibly in lockdown themselves, do you think?
It's been really fascinating working on this with Simon, having already done Gawain and the Green Knight. When I came to Gawain and the Green Knight a few years ago, it had already been published. It was originally published in 2007, so I came to it as a reader. I wasn't actually working with Simon on Gawain and the Green Knight, the illustrated edition. He asked me to do it, but really I just read the poem and then worked. Whereas The Owl and the Nightingale was much more interesting in a way, because I was reading his translations as he was making them of the poem. And so I was seeing the change from the Middle English to the translation that was eventually made. And whereas Gawain is a kind of adventure in a way, set in the age of chivalry, it's a quest, it's mystical. The Owl and the Nightingale is a satire. It falls into the genre that's known as debate poetry, and it's about the rivalry between an owl and a nightingale, who both think that they're the superior birds. And it's
come back to that.
Funny.
We'll come back to that a little bit more later.
Okay.
But it's true to say, I suppose, that you've always been interested in drawing animals. Horses you've become rather known for, and dogs and wolves and birds. What is it about animals and their connections with us that draws you in?
I think the stories are always so interesting. I mean, it's fascinating as an artist to be drawing things other than people, and animals are extremely paintable. I live surrounded by animals here at TSF, and I particularly have been drawn to the mythology and the folklore of birds. And so here we have Kevin and the Sunflowers, which is based on the Seamus Heaney poem, Kevin and the Blackbird, which is really pretty much as I know about St. Kevin. He's a fairly mythic saint, not a great deal is known about him, but the Seamus Heaney poem is so heart-achingly beautiful. The notion of this man holding out the palm of his hand and the blackbird coming and building her nest in it and trusting him and laying her eggs, and the eggs hatching and fledging and the bird flying the nest. I just think that although the story is unrealistic, it hits so many notes that appeal to our hearts about the nature of sacrifice. And I've been thinking a lot about Kevin because, of course, he was immured in a hermitage while he was looking after this blackbird. His arm stuck out of the window for her to nest in outside. And, you know, we've been in lockdown, and it's been interesting to think on those themes written of by Seamus Heaney at a point when he wouldn't have known anything about a pandemic. I think that taking poetry and literature and being able to find things within it that help us in whichever situation we're in, that's something that I've done all my life, really. And here we have the prophet Isaiah and his raven that lives in South Carolina with Anita Mills, who I can see in the corner of my screen. Hello, Anita. And the prophet and his raven has been back and forward to Anita's house several times over the course of its life, and is there now. This is the single painting I've made that has appeared on more book covers than any other.
it's an example of you transforming a bird into something else. You know, ravens aren't usually flame red. And at other times, as we'll see in a moment, you're much more naturalistic. So what is it you're looking for? Why do you divert into different directions like that?
I'm looking for the hit, really. I'm looking for the emotional hit. It's the same kind of hit that I have as an artist, that I have as a reader when I'm reading poetry or a novel, or when I'm cooking and making a recipe. It's that hit that you get when you know that the flavor combinations are just right. And so I think that's always what I'm looking for when I'm painting. Painting or drawing is, you start with nothing and you're building and building until there is something, and then that something has to go further. You have to stretch it further. You have to stretch it as far as it will go until suddenly it hits that moment where the bell rings and you think, this is it. This is hitting the tone that I want. And if that requires that I paint a horse red or a raven green, then that's what it takes to do it.
The Virgin of the Goldfinches, which is a picture that was commissioned by the Contemporary Art Society and is now well known to lots of people in Llandaff Cathedral, is obviously enormously stylized in certain aspects, but the goldfinches themselves, to me, feel the most naturalistic element in the whole thing.
I think they're probably the most naturalistic birds I've ever painted. And part of the reason for that was that they entered the painting quite late. I tend to paint what I see around me. If I'm painting at a certain time of the year, then the plants that appear in the paintings are the ones that are in the garden at that time. And it just so happened that there were goldfinches at the feeders when I went out to draw birds on the day that I was looking for something to add to the painting. And in fact, the goldfinches became absolutely significant to the painting in all sorts of ways, because of their mythic association with Christ, and the fact that the red of their heads is supposed to have been gained from the thorns on his crown. But at the time that I went out to paint them, I was just looking for birds. The subject of the painting hadn't quite formed in my head until I had them on my desk, as it were, as little drawings.
There are quite a number of religious paintings that include birds, and this one is the story of St. Francis, isn't it?
It is. It's St. Francis preaching to the birds. It would be hard not to like St. Francis for all of the things that he represented and the way in which he was so sympathetic to the natural world. And the stories of his preaching to the birds have reached out and caught imaginations of artists and of people. He also had a great deal of trouble in hanging onto his clothes. He persistently stripped himself of his clothes and gave them to the poor. So I've combined the two things here. And do you know, I painted this so long ago, I've kind of forgotten what the process of it was. It was certainly led by the birds that I wanted to paint. The rook was certainly a rook, one of many rooks that we see here at Tiesa. There's a rookery just behind the house. And the barn owl that you see in it, in fact, you can see behind me. It's a taxidermied owl that normally sits in our bedroom, but which I've put behind, or Peter put behind me here. And the feathers were what I needed on the taxidermied owl in order to make the owl that you see here. But again, I'm stylizing birds and kind of creating them in the way that they need to be for the painting. For me, there's a bit of a problem with observational drawing and painting, because as an artist, for me, that gets between me and the subject matter. And so I'm always trying to stretch beyond that. So I do lots of studies from life, but then I like to have the time to be able to develop those and take them further. to where I want the painting to go and how I want the tone of it to feel.
This picture seems to me one of the sort of leaps into a different kind of stylization with the depiction of birds. And we've got one of the other prints from the series on the wall behind me, but this is another one. There were 14 prints in the series telling the story of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. This one's called The Green Knight's Head Lives, as the knight who's been decapitated picks up his head and puts it back on again. But on his horse's comparison, we see all these peacocks, you would say, flying about.
Yes, they are peacocks.
What was the role of the birds in this particular picture?
Do you know, Gawain and the Green Knight is full of descriptions. It's an extraordinary poem of descriptions. They are endless, and the descriptions of what the Green Knight looks like, what Gawain looks like, the chasing on Gawain's armor, the painting on the inside of his shield, it goes on for pages and pages. And the poem is wonderful, but that kind of detail can just clog up an artist's creativity. And so I very often abandoned the descriptions that were in the poems when I was working on this series and tried to make images in which the symbolism had a kind of universality that would work for people. And for me, I wanted that the Green Knight's horse should represent many things. It's the only thing in the picture apart from him. In the poem, the courtiers are gathered around the Green Knight when this event takes place. I didn't want a room for courtiers behind him. I wanted something that was more primal and counterbalanced to the extraordinary event of him picking up his own head. And I always think that peacocks have such an impact on people. Peacocks turn up in art all over the world, from the Middle East to the West. The eyes in the peacock's tails seem to have a resonance and a magical significance for people. And so I wanted to make a counterbalance to the event of the Green Knight picking up his head with something really visceral on the other side of the composition. And so here we have his horse with its ears back and its terrified eye, and the caparissoning on its neck was the opportunity to put these rather mystical images of peacocks flying and symbolic eyes that I felt were the right balance to what was going on in the rest of the image.
That became the publication, Gawain and Green Knight from Faber, the illustrated edition of Simon Armitage's book. Do you want to tell us how that came about? You know, you've been working on Gawain before you became involved with Simon and before this was done.
Dan Bugg of Penfold Press and I were making a series of 14 edition prints based on Simon Armitage's 2007 translation, which I'd loved. I'd carried a copy with me for many years, always making notes in it. And we started on the series of 14 prints, which was very ambitious. And we didn't seek permission from Simon Armitage because we weren't going to be using any of the text in the images or to promote the images. We weren't going to use Simon Armitage's name. We just thought we could sneak under the wire by me using his translation as my inspiration. But gradually it got out that his translation was the one I was using, and the story is a long one and too long to tell here, but eventually I had an email from him saying, excuse me, but what are you doing? And it turned out that he loved the prints and that he wanted to collaborate with me so that they could be used in the planned 2018 revision of the 2007 translation. And that's what happened. It was published by Llandaff in 2018 with the 14 images in the book they were cropped because the images are square and the book is rectangular, but I did the cropping, and I really like the cropping in the book because it makes them feel more like close-ups in the film. So it was, Simon asked me to work on it, and it was a wonderful thing because I loved his translation so much. It slightly affected how I felt about what I was doing, because he asked me when I'd only made 6 of the 14 prints, and it was very hard to set aside the fact that they were going to appear in the illustrated edition once I had it in my head. But I did try to set that aside so that I just continued with the 14 prints in the way that I'd intended. And then from that, other things evolved. We've done 3 books together now and a stage production.
We've got a question that's come in from Michael Guillen, who's asking birds being intelligible in their beauty through their display of plumage and flight and song. And he's asking how you capture those different kinds of display in your media. And I think perhaps if I go to the next image, which is this one, maybe that's one to talk it through with.
Yes. Well, there's another level of abstraction here as I'm kind of thinking about the idea of sacrifice. This, in fact, was a commission by Daniel Broncano, who's the artistic director of Musica on Segura in Spain. And he asked me to make 3 images that would be projected above the heads of the orchestra players who were going to be playing Messiaen. And it was this idea that Messiaen had used bird song in his music. There it is in performance with the painting projected onto the wall behind the orchestra. It was the idea that Messiaen had used birds within his composition that made me go in this direction, although of course, yet again, I used peacocks. I used peacocks because I'd already used them during Gawain, and they were kind of in my head, and I felt comfortable with them. Peacocks are not known for their song, and so Messiaen was definitely not thinking about peacocks for his quartet for the end of time. But they suited the restlessness that I wanted for the composition. I think it's very hard to describe what it is that makes you paint or image birds in a certain way. I don't even think about it that much when I do it. I just start with the pencils, and it's as though all the observation that you've poured into looking at birds all your life, all the feelings that you have for them, they just kind of find their way out of your hand like you're a fountain pen and the ink is flowing through. So I don't have an answer as to why I present them the way I do, except that it is a feeling. I do feel incredibly emotionally attached when I'm making images of birds, and they don't have to be real birds. They can be toy birds, as they are in this image. This was another one I did for the Quartet for the End of Time. And here we have a Christ. I was very much thinking of the Grunwald altarpiece with the Christ with the terrible marks of having been flagellated, which I always find so moving in that altarpiece. But the items that are either side of Christ are in fact American folk art, carved wooden stands with wooden birds on. And there's just something about them that I love so much. I change these things, of course. I don't draw them, paint them exactly as they are in reality. And so I played fast and loose here. But I just think that sense of the little trees of life either side of Christ suffering with the the wooden birds, it hits the note for me. And I hope it hits the note for the people who look at it.
I wouldn't know how to explain it, but I think in Michael's question about the display that birds have, this picture somehow does capture the sound of the birds. There's something about the sharpness, the perkiness, the flitting, the sense of placing that seems like they might be singing and chirruping.
Well, I hope so. I did listen to Quartet for the End of Time all the time while I was working on these paintings. So I do feel that there is some kind of flow that goes through you when you're listening to music. I listen to music a lot when I work. I choose it very carefully, but in this case, it was a given that I'd listened to the Messiaen, and I used a maquette.
We haven't
Christ.
We haven't said, but in case people don't know, Messiaen was a bird spotter and fascinated with birds, and based a lot of his music on bird song, didn't he?
He did, and he was in a prisoner of war camp when he wrote Quartet for the End of Time. So it has a lot of resonance of ideas of suffering. Yes.
Well, we'll move back to Simon Armitage again now and talk about the Hansel and Gretel collaboration and the book, which recently won the Victoria and Albert Museum Book Illustrator of the Year Award for you, which was very nice. Could you tell us how that project with Simon came about and how you responded to it?
I was already working with Simon on Gawain and the Green Knight when I was approached by a producer, a music producer, to ask if I would consider doing a project with her company. And after a few ideas that she tried out on me that I didn't much care for, she asked me whether or not I would be interested in doing anything on the theme of Hansel and Gretel. I had already made a Hansel and Gretel toy theatre for Benjamin Pollock's toy shop in London, and she saw the designs for that around the studio and some other related Hansel and Gretel material, and she suggested that that might be an idea. From then, we started talking about who would compose it and who would write it. And because I was working with Simon, I suggested that it would be lovely if he could be persuaded to write the text for this music theatre piece. And in due course, he agreed, and he did. And he brought the most incredible dynamism to the project because he just took off and wrote something that none of us expected. He absolutely focused on the idea of the children as refugees. He kicked out of the field completely the notion of the mother as the villainess in the story. Instead, we had a family who were really up against it in a war-torn zone. The parents were utterly loving and dedicated to their children, but felt they simply weren't safe where they were, and so pushed them out into the world in order to see if they could find their way somewhere where there weren't bombs that were going to destroy them. So it happened at a point when Syria was much in the news and refugees were in the news and Nigel Farage was banging on the news all the time, and it just hit so many notes that moved us all in the production team. And so we did it as a stage performance, and it opened at the Cheltenham Music Festival, and it toured for 6 months, and it premiered in London at the Barbican. During that time, Simon came to me and asked me whether or not I thought that there would be a place for it as a publication, as an illustrated edition. And did I know of a publisher, perhaps a small-scale private press publisher, who would be interested in such a project? And I knew immediately that I'd wanted to work for a long time with Joe Pearson at his wonderful publishing company, Design for Today, which focuses very much on British design, on British book design, on the great golden era of traditional book design. And Joe Pearson and I worked together with Simon in order to bring about the publication of it. And we worked and eventually brought it into the world. It was a complete labor of love. I've never done so many proofs for a book ever. I think Joe must have put us through about 60 versions of it before we eventually landed at what was published. And what was astonishing really was that we managed to win the V&A Illustrated Book Award with it, because it's a very small publishing company. Other bigger publishers throw lots of money at the V&A Awards. And it was, I think we had a very outside chance of winning, but we did. I'm very proud of it. It was a complete labor of love, and Simon's text just illustrates beautifully. It's a little animated bird that I used for the animated book trailer.
Michael has just submitted another question about whether you've ever illustrated a bird that has gone extinct or one that doesn't exist. And I think you might have some that don't exist in this picture. Yes,
they are made up, a lot of them.
Except that perhaps they do.
Well, they exist in the illustrations, don't they? Well, yes. And if the camera comes on me for a moment, there she is, my little Russian bird. She's been with me through several projects. She won't shut up now. And she appears in, she appeared in the stage production of Hansel and Gretel, and in an animated film. And then she appeared in the book of Hansel and Gretel. Here she is meeting herself in an illustration. And she also appears in Birdhouse, the book I've done with Joe at Design for Today. She's getting.
What is it about toy birds in particular that attract you?
Well, mainly the toy birds that I'm attracted to fall into the folk art tradition, although there are various traditions of birds. This is a chenille bird made in China. It's absolutely tiny. They don't make these things anymore, but they were very popular at one time in gift shops. Here's a little collection I have of them. And I can't imagine how small the fingers were of the people who made them, but there's something in this that moves me so much. It's the way in which objects can be invested with life. It's the way in which you can look at something and feel that there is an inner world. And for me as an artist, they're wonderful starting points for images, for painting, and for illustration. You know, when I work, I often use models, human models, that I then turn into maquettes before I make the drawings. I don't work with the model directly into the drawing and painting. I turn them into a puppet before I turn them into a painting. And it's as though these little folk art birds are already part way there for me. You know, they've already made that translation to being an object, and then I can make the translation of them into a painting. But they come freighted with some meaning for me that I can't quite describe. These are little Polish painted wooden birds. The two in the background are by an artist called Zach, and there's just something about them. There's something about their color. There's something about the way they're posed. They just hit the spot for me, and they make me emotional when I'm working with them. And therefore, they're very good models for me to use in paintings. You saw these two particular birds in the illustration of Hansel and Gretel, where Hansel and Gretel stand either side of a bowl of fruit, and the birds are emerging. And found objects for me are wonderful starting points for making images, whether paintings or illustrations. And the bowl of fruit in the Hansel and Gretel illustration in fact, was an American folk art chalkware bowl of fruit made out of plaster of Paris and painted, and I added these little Polish painted birds to it. There's something about the naivety. The folk artist has already done so much of the work for me, and I just have to, in some way, assemble the image and capture the quality of it and make the connection.
And you do play with them as well.
Between the images and the text.
You do play with them as well.
I do play with them. Play is essential. I simply couldn't be the artist I am without play. And, you know, sometimes you're playing and you don't know why you're playing. You don't know where the project is going. And because I felt so deeply about the European Union, I started making these little assemblages. And I think probably, I'm not quite sure, if you were here, he'd be able to tell you, but I think that there was something about these that Joe Pearson then came to me and said, would you like to work on this little project to make a picture book about birds? And I think at the time that he asked me, he'd been looking at these, and he asked me whether I'd like to do a little book of British birds maybe. And in fact, I ended up making a book that is called Birdhouse, and it combines all sorts of birds from my collection, folk art birds, chenille birds, little plaster of Paris birds, with little buildings. These buildings here are tiny little buildings from the Black Forest region of Germany, which is a toy making region. These are vintage images. So all of these things get piled together for me into creating worlds that I play with, and then they evolve into other things, sometimes into illustration, sometimes into painting. Well, this strikes a special chord for me. As a child, I played with Pollock's toy theatre scenes. I never had a Pollock's toy theatre, but I had the toy theatre scenes that were given to me by an old actor friend of my parents. And this is a recent acquisition by me from Benjamin Pollock's toy shop, who was selling some archival material. And it's a scene from Benjamin Pollock's Sleeping Beauty. And it's an original print made at the time that these were so popular as entertainments. And they were produced as penny plain, tuppence coloured. You could buy them penny plain and paint them yourself, or you could buy them tuppence coloured and they'd be professionally coloured. And this is slightly ruined because it's broken at the corner. But what I love about it is it's stuck on card. It is a scene that's been used in a toy theatre production by somebody. And I believe it's been professionally coloured by the teams of colourists who used to work in the East End of London, colouring in these images for sale at Benjamin Pollock's toy shop. And I've always wanted one of these scenes. I've never possessed one, but I managed to get this one recently. And for me, it is a link between my childhood, when I loved Benjamin Pollock's toy theatres. When I was a little bit older and went to school in London, I used to haunt Benjamin Pollock's toy shop and museum. And in later life, of course, I became a designer for Benjamin Pollock's toy shop, making the Hansel and Gretel toy theatre. So this kind of binds everything together. It's beautiful, isn't it? Looks to me entirely like a Victorian idea of paradise, but in fact it looks like a 19th century grotto with its, you know, very artificial plants and its vista and its constructed grotto effect.
We're going to move into talking about The Owl and the Nightingale now, the project that Simon Armitage has asked you to do, and Faber have asked you to illustrate. What was your first impression of reading Simon's first rough translation of The Owl and the Nightingale?
I was very surprised. I'd never read The Owl and the Nightingale. I knew about it, but I hadn't really cottoned on to what it was. Like I say, Gawain is a chivalric romance, and it's full of mystery and romance and a quest. Whereas the Owl and the Nightingale, which is earlier than Gawain, it was written in Middle English, but it's earlier than Gawain. Gawain was 14th century. I think the Owl and the Nightingale is 12th, 13th century. It's a satire, and it's what was called a debate poem, in which two characters, in this case two birds, argue with each other over their merits. It's very boastful. Each thinks she's better than the other. And I was staggered at the diversity of the arguments and how vicious it got. I remember at the time, I was thinking, this is as bad as anything that you see at Facebook. I mean, this is really quite unpleasant. And Simon's contemporary language is so visceral and lively and funny. So it wasn't what I expected. I suppose in some part of my mind, I thought it was going to be more mythic. It was going to be, you know, something that I could relate to on those themes. But in fact, it felt very, very contemporary. And I just dived straight into it. I felt as though it needed not a reflection in the imagery. I felt that the imagery needed to be something else to balance against it. And Simon had said from the beginning, I would like this book to have the vibrancy of an illuminated manuscript. And so we looked at illuminated manuscripts, and illuminated manuscripts are beautiful, but they are usually, not always, because they can be about secular subjects too, like the hunt and bestiaries, but usually they're associated with religious writing. And so I knew that we would be taking a visual theme that might be associated with Bibles and prayer books, but then turning it into something that was far more secular. And he also said, don't make it look like a pastiche. I want you to do it the way you paint, the way you think. And so I was able to just go in the direction that my heart took me with it. And it's not going to be out until 2021, but I'm so pleased with the results. And I had to do it all at quite a small scale because I normally have access to the National Library of Wales to get my artworks for books scanned, ready to send to the publisher. But on this occasion, that wasn't available to me. So I had to do everything small enough to go onto my desktop printer, which is A4 size. So everything got very small, quite hard on the eyes. But I think it also kind of made it intense. That was me doing drawings with little Polish folk art birds scattered around the drawing as I was working on it.
Anita Mills in North Carolina has asked if birds come to you in your dreams, you know, whether in some way the birds that you draw express the birds that you dream as well as the birds that you see.
Well, I would have said once no, but increasingly in lockdown, yes. I suppose that in common with everybody else, my dreams have become incredibly vivid, and I wake up 5 times a night having had dreams that have been so extraordinary that they've awoken me from my sleep. And increasingly, I have been dreaming about birds, sometimes in good ways and sometimes in not so good ways, but always. You know, this morning I woke up very, very early thinking about this event and how it would work and hoping that everything would be okay. And I woke up in the dark and listened to the birds as the sun came up. It was very misty outside. There was a sea mist, and I was lying there wanting to be asleep. But the persistent soundtrack to our lives here at TSA are the birds. And it's different in winter and spring, but this morning, before the sun came up in the pitch black, I could hear the rooks getting going, and I could hear the owls, and then there was a blackbird who was having some kind of terrible fight in the box hedge just outside the window. And as the light came, I could see birds dive bombing around the windows. And I got up and opened my window just a tad and went to the bathroom and had a shower and came back in to find a bird in my bedroom, a little blue tit sitting on the windowsill looking at me as though it was the most natural place in the world to be. So.
And you think that really happened?
No, that did happen, Peter. You weren't there, but it happened.
Well, that does sound rather like the dreams that have that like dreams, and that's filtered into your work, or maybe the work is filtered into the dreams.
Both.
Can you tell us about what the Owl and the Nightingale will be like as a book?
I think it'll be a wonderful read. Physically, it's going to have a number of full-page images. All the full-page images are vibrant colour on black ground. They bleed to the edge, so there's no border. And then within the text, there will be vignettes and illustrations that, together with the designers of the book, we will wrap the text around the illustrations. Simon was very, very keen on having illuminated capitals. And this is quite a challenge, because illuminated capitals work very well when the text is handwritten, when you have the calligraphy of the illuminator that can balance the text to the illuminated capitals. But when you're making a contemporary book, you're working with mechanical fonts. And so I had to go through endless permutations of producing decorative elements for the illuminated capitals that can mix and match in order to fit with a mechanical font. So it was a great idea, but it took a lot of working out. And I haven't yet started working with the designers at Faber to see how it all works when we put it together, but I've kind of made a portfolio with a huge amount of material in it that I hope I've covered all of the angles. This is the owl as she thinks of herself as being rather mystical, a little bit like a sibyl with an affinity to the moon. The nightingale accuses the owl of being a bird of ill omen, of only ever being around when there's about to be a death. And so this was my version of what the nightingale thinks of the owl, and that she's the harbinger of doom. And you can see here the flaming house and the owl with her scythe.
Rebecca in California asked a question a few minutes ago about the fact that you work with birds and you work with toys with a lightness, but you also have very dark themes. And how do you find these sort of counterpoint each other? And I suppose this illustration rather brings that out.
Yes, I mean, I think anybody who knows me would know that I have an interest in the dark side of things. I think life is a balance between light and dark, and certainly my painting, my work, my practice as an artist balances between light and dark. All the subjects that I tend to choose are ones that have that balance in them. And so, yes, and in the mythology of birds, you have very positive things, but you have very negative things. And the owl and the nightingale points that up beautifully. We think of owls now as just being wonderful birds that are fighting for their place in the world, whereas in the past they were hunted down, they were killed. Farmers used to use them as scarecrows in fields. People feared them because of their association with the night. People disliked them because their cry was not considered to be musical. It was not that of a songbird. So all of these layers of mythology and folklore and how people view things, that's grist to my mill. I like bringing all of those things together. I wanted that this book should be very positive in the sense of color and design in it, but I also understand that the characteristics being expressed by the birds in it are very human and very often very ugly and boastful. We won't talk about ugly and boastful in the news. There's plenty of it. But it was interesting listening to some of the political debates while working on this book and reading the arguments between these two birds, both of whom are quite unlikable in many aspects of their characters. lots of sgraffito here, using an etching needle to make texture.
This is your chance to dish the dirt on the Poet Laureate. What's it been like working with him?
Oh, he's a sweetie. Working with Simon is wonderful. He gives the impression of being a man without ego. I mean, everything is debate and discussion. He's very open. He's very funny to work with. I pester him endlessly. I'm somebody who likes to share everything as I'm doing it. I'm quite sure that most of the time he wishes I'd go away and just show him the finished work, but I like to show and tell and get feedback, and he's very tolerant of that. So yes, I'm happy as a sandboy when working with him, and I don't think we would have done 3 books together without having had a degree of getting on.
I'm going to move on to another book now, which is actually, we were told at the printers today, and your second book for Design for Today, which is called Birdhouse, or The Birdhouse, and this is a drawing for it with one of your toy birds in connection to the drawing. What was the impetus for this book?
Well, like I say, Joe had suggested that I make maybe a book of British birds, and somehow that didn't quite appeal to me. There are so many of them, I wasn't quite sure how to go about it and bring something new to the idea. And I'd been commissioned by Benjamin Pollock's Toy Shop to design a pop-up card, and I designed it, but the pandemic got in the way, and it was pulled. Production was pulled on it, and so even though I'd done a lot of the work, it didn't go any further. So I had this thing that was kind of unfinished in me, that it was like a hiccup that wouldn't come out. You know, it had sort of got so far and no further. And this pop-up card, which was very elaborate, was going to be called the Palace of Birds. And it was in fact a structure, a kind of open, not a cage, an open pavilion that had a tree of life in it that was covered in birds. And I'd worked very hard on it. And so these ideas were in my mind. So when Joe asked me to make this book, I, to begin with, was going to call it the Palace of Birds and was going to make lots of images of birds in rather elaborate cages. But then I suddenly started thinking that I wanted it not to be so narrow. I decided that I wanted to use all sorts of little Staffordshire cottages and Black Forest model houses. And I just put the 2 words together, bird house, to make the book. There is no text. It's just a combination of birds of all sorts and what might be called their houses. And here's my desk. Ah, there she is again. This time with a little Byzantine palace strapped to her back. She's the cover girl of Birdhouse. And Birdhouse is extremely small. It's a tiny little book. It's 16 pages, and it's based on the old Bantam toy books that were published back in the 1940s, I think. And Joe somehow, because he's so respected, has had permission to reprint some of the Bantam books. He'd republished 2 little Bantam books by the artist Hilary Stebbing, and I'd been admiring them for a long time. And when he asked me if I would do Birdhouse, because he was considering commissions for a revival of the Bantam picture books, these little 16-page picture books, just very simple paper books stapled together, but done with lovely lithographic printing. Because he was considering that, he asked whether I'd like to be involved, and I just leapt at it with Birdhouse. This is a little they're called Putz houses. They're very popular in America. They probably originally came from Germany, although later they started being made in Japan. And they're little glitter houses made out of cardboard that come out at Christmas. And here I've made a sort of fantastic version of one with a little Polish bird perched on top of it. It really is a good idea, Birdhouse. You know, you can put together so many ideas on that theme. I did all these images, but I could have done 100 more. The ideas just went on and on.
Well, having talked about that book, which is at the Press now and will be available in November, I think it's a good opportunity to open up to questions from the audience. So if people who are on Zoom who can ask questions would like to just send me a message on chat using the chat function on the bottom of the screen to give me your name, I'll call you in, and at that point you can enable your microphone and ask a question and appear directly. But we've got a couple of questions that have already come in on chat. So there's one from Liz Fraser. After working on the pencil and gouache birds, will you be tempted to tackle some more oils? And do you have favourite media?
I think that my favourite media, it's like saying, you know, what's your favourite painting? What is the favourite book you've done? My answer is always the one I'm working on at that point. And I haven't been doing easel painting for some time because I've been so involved in working with Simon Armitage, doing the stage production of Hansel and Gretel. So I've been very focused on illustration, but I do have some, I don't want to talk too much about it at the moment, but I certainly have a big easel project that's coming up, and I know that there will be birds involved in it, although the subject matter is quite a serious subject matter. I think that you carry with you from one subject to another everything that you've learned on the previous one, and you know, every time I start a new series of work, I'm not the painter I was because I'm carrying with me what I've just become in the last project. I love working in mixed media. I love oil. I love water-based medium. I work in acrylic a lot. I love drawing. I love working with drawing over gouache. I'm working on a project at the moment with Design for Today to do an homage to the Jean Cocteau film La Belle et la Bête, which will all be pencil over gouache. I find that, you know, the subject tells me what material I need to be using. And if I'm at the easel, then clearly I'm not going to be using pencil over gouache, but I use the materials that are right for the subject. I'm not wedded to anything. I'm quite plural in the way in which I work.
And you tend to work in series, so I guess you know, you're going to find yourself in the studio or you know, at the table or at the easel, depending on what project is in your mind at the moment.
I've been working at the table in our dining room, Peter, as you well know, for most of the summer because the light in there is so good. It's got a splayed bay window overlooking the garden, and I've enjoyed working at the table. I always stand when I work, so when I'm working at the table, I'm standing and bending over the table. I do all of my illustration work at a table. I do all of my painting at an easel. I'm going to be having a big clear up of my studio shortly, so I can get back to my giant easel there for the next body of work.
There's a live question from Alison MacLeod. So Alison, if you'd unmute yourself and ask your question, that would be great.
I will. Hello, Clive. Hi.
Hello, Alison. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Lovely to see you, and thank you. Thank you for fascinating discussion. And Peter, thank you. Clive, well, you know, I admire endless amounts of your work. I'm thinking, I know you're working on La Belle et la Bête, and there's so many things going on. We share an interest, as you know, in clockwork toys and wind-up toys. Might there be another project following the birds? Other points of inspiration in your collection?
I should tell everybody that you and I have a relationship, don't we? We've worked together. Alison is an author, and a wonderful one, and was one of the authors on a book of short stories that were commissioned by English Heritage last year. Was it last year?
A year and a half ago, something like that.
Yeah, called These Are Monsters, for which you wrote an absolutely beautiful story. So we've already worked together as writer and illustrator. So in answer to your question, I should probably say, I don't know, Alison, what can you come up with?
Well, goodness, wouldn't that would be a treat? Because you said something tonight, Clive, that really stayed with me. Usually clockwork toys are discussed in terms of the uncanny and the unsettling, that sort of borderline between life and death. Freud does, like Angela Carter uses them in often quite sinister, troubling ways, and they're fascinating. But you're the first one, and I think that's where our love of clockwork crosses over. It's wonderful to hear you saying about how moving they are, and that's what I find in them. And no one else has ever articulated that before. For me, I think it's the way they seem to yearn after life. They're just yearning through their colour and their motion, and you capture that so brilliantly. So I'm always moved when I look at your birds and you know, the clockwork you have in Hansel and Gretel.
I think that you know, when I was a young man, I was a puppeteer. It's a hopeless route to go down, because you never come out of it. You never emerge the same. Puppeteers, I think puppeteers are a dark breed. You know, we see things that other people don't see. And I feel that the way in which we invest toys, whether they're animate or inanimate, clockwork or stuffed toys, the way we invest them with life and what they can mean to us, I think most people feel it at some level. It's just that most people don't express it, or they don't talk about it, or even acknowledge it. But I think that these things kind of get under your skin. I made a little cockerel the other day. I was working on something, and I had some epoxy putty. And at the end of the project, I had a little bit left over, and I made a cockerel. And it is the most mangled and misshapen cockerel, but I put it to dry in the kitchen. And it's such an ugly thing. And I've tried to throw it away 20 times and I can't. It just looks at me and says, no, you made me. And I can't do it. I mean, you know, I love animals and I love people. Of course, I drift toward that which is living, but inanimate things kind of live in my heart and in my imagination, and they represent things. And so, yes, I am tied to them. We must do another project.
Thank you, Alison. There's a question from Michael Guillen as well.
Clive, greetings from Idaho in the United States. Thank you so much for being so forthcoming about your process here. I'm curious, you helped me so much via Facebook and via this discussion to cope with the isolation of the COVID pandemic. Have you ever considered what it might look like for you if it were a bird?
The pandemic.
Yes.
I hadn't considered what it might look like, but that's certainly sown a seed in my head. I think
you might need to refer to Hitchcock.
Yes. Yes, maybe The Birds is the pandemic, which is a favorite film of mine. I think that, yes, I think that it is more likely to be a multiple than a single entity. I would think of it as being a flock. But I think that the pandemic, it's interesting that so many artists are painting the pandemic or painting the virus. I see I see artists all over the world are being fueled by a desire to try and represent it in some way. And I have not. I've gone down the route of making the owl and the nightingale and going down a path of light, because I find that if I try too hard to think about this great thing that we're all confronting, it kind of undoes me. So I'm not Pollyanna or Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm, but I do find that in these dark times that I anchor myself by going into the studio and picking up these little things and finding the bright creativity in them. And it's not because I'm unaware of or not thinking about what's going on out there. Even where we live in these bucolic surroundings. You can't be unaware of what's going on in the world. It filters into and sometimes taints everything. And I think that the work of lockdown for me has been to fight that. There's plenty out there that is
Well, actually,
presenting it in some way, or going head to head with it. I've been head to head with a number of demons in my life as an artist, and right now I don't want to. I'm softer and more yielding and wanting to not armor myself in the same way as I once did.
And if I may, Peter, I have a question for you as Clive's roommate. I'm wondering what it's like for you to witness the processing of the unfolding of an image from Clive's vision.
Often very confusing. I think, where on earth is he going with the next one? Because there's a period where I think for quite a long way through a project, I think, where's this come from? Where's it going to go? What is he after this time? Because I think Clive's somebody who likes to be constantly investigating and changing and exploring new ideas, and it takes me a while to catch up sometimes. I like to think that sometimes I give him a sense of direction, and but generally speaking, I'm working hard to catch up these days.
Thank you both.
And actually, one of the things that I find very interesting about looking at images in reflection sometime after they've been done is, and I probably shouldn't say this, but I realise they're so much better than I ever thought they were. They take time to grow on you sometimes, to get to know them. There's a question from Neil, which I think follows on from the pandemic question in the end. Neil in Cardiff, who's, are you, some of your work was very dark in the past, particularly the Mary Lloyd drawings, and he's talking about an image of a male figure metamorphosing into a bird. Do you think the pandemic or anything else might take you into even darker imagery again at some point?
I don't know is the answer to that. We can't talk about it, but Peter, that there are projects on the back burner that might go to quite dark places, although not necessarily anything that's focused on the pandemic. I'm working on La Belle et la Bête, which I think is the most romantic film, most poetic film ever made. But I find that even that is full of darkness, which I relish. But I never know where things are going, and particularly I don't know in this world as it is now. All bets are off, all things have changed. We're none of us sure where we're going. I just go to the studio every day and get as much done on that day as I can. I have this theory these days, given that everything is so infinitely changeable. I want to go to the studio, and at the end of the day, when I leave it, I want there to be something beautiful on the table, something that I believe in, something that I think is the best I can do that day, even if it's unfinished. That's kind of my plan at the moment, to keep on doing the best each day, but it's kind of condensed because you know, at one point it was, well, the best I can do this week, the best I can do this month, the best I can do this year, but at the moment it's the best I can do each day.
We're very near the end now, but Maria Hayes has a question. So Maria, would you?
May I just interrupt you and say we seem to have been missing a project, which is the Tiger's Bride.
Yes, I'm going to come back to that in a second, but let's give Maria the chance to ask her question.
Hello, Maria.
Hi, Peter, and thank you. Sorry, hi, Clive. Thank you for your work. It's so inspiring, and you know, I follow you on Facebook, and I thoroughly need and enjoy seeing the birds emerge every day. And I think the role of beauty and light in these times of darkness is both challenging to deliver and really, really important work. So first of all, thank you. And my question is,
yes.
When do you start work on the Conference of Birds?
I should be, shouldn't I? I don't know. Well, that's another one that's lit a little candle in my head that I need to be thinking about. Very often, particularly with illustration projects, I'm led by the authors, you know, or the publishers who come to me with an idea. I'm quite choosy. I only do the things that I really can see that I'm a good fit for. And then there are the book projects which I kind of instigate with the publisher. That essentially was what I did with Belle et la Bête. But the Conference of Birds, no, I can see that as being stamped all over with my name. So thank you for that. I think I'll go and write it on a post-it note and put it on my desk. A good one.
Excellent.
One very quick question. One very quick question's come in. A greeting from Thomas in Sweden. A question from Angela asking whether, and a very brief answer please, whether your bright jewel-like colours, luminous colours are a response to the times, do you think?
I think they probably are, yes. I certainly I yearn for colour and brightness, particularly as the winter is coming on and everything's going to be darker, and it's harder to paint in the winter here in this old house.
I'm going to show a couple more pictures and then we're going to have to finish. So, where's it gone? There we are. Just to say, there have been two more prints from the Penfold Press that you've done very recently. This one last year, A Return to Kevin and the Blackbird. And this one that, again, is the printing of this screen print is being finished today, the Tiger's Bride, with birds in it. Nice to see that birds are in your very most recent work that's coming to fruition. Very last word, I think, goes to Phil Cooper in Berlin. I think he signed himself Phil C, so I think that's who it is. And Phil's got a very quick question for you, which is in relation to Simon Armitage's conversations in the shed. He asked people after conversation, are you in favour of owl or nightingale? Owl or nightingale, Clive?
Owl.
How unexpectedly straightforward. So
you said no description.
I'm going to say there are lots of thanks coming in from people on chat, and we have an end card. So I'm going to close with that and say thank you very much to everyone for taking part. It's been wonderful to see you, and I hope that there'll be many more occasions like this for us to enjoy. Thanks, everybody.
That was great. It's very good. Super.